percentage of us. And okay, of those of you who got the vote, I'm not going to do anything as partisan as ask how you're going to vote. I actually declared in the Edinburgh Festival last night how I was voting, which I have already done, and actually made the heretical comment, if some things happen, I might publicly change how I was voting, which of course you're not meant to do. It's a one-out process you're meant to do, you know. So, hands up who knows which way they're voting. Okay, and let's have hands up who, you know, give any element of doubt possible who's not sure, or... Okay, so we'll have to try and shoot that out a bit. Right, so I'm going to do about 15 minutes, maximum 20, and that's going to be what time for comments, observations, questions. Sometimes we do these things, some people, I mean, I know you'll be a far wiser audience than this, sometimes some people think because you've written a book talking on subjects, you know the answer to every single area about Scotland or policy or politics in the world. Just let me cast that illusion aside, that isn't me, I'm not going to make that claim, so sorry for that. I'm going to start with, I think it is quite significant. 1 month ago, some of us have thought, are there any game changers left in this referendum? One game changer previously had been UKIP winning the Euro elections and polling badly in Scotland. They polled enough in Scotland for that narrative not to catch fire. They won 30% in England, they won 10% in Scotland. It's a big difference, but they won an MEP in Scotland. Then there's the game changer of the rising UK economy, and with that rising Tory opinion polls, whether that would be a factor. And then we've got the debates. Debate won down clearly, you know, and all polling evidence won by Alistair Darling and lost by Alex Salmond. Now, one thing that is another game changer is significant public figures coming out for yes or no. So we've had 200 celebrities saying, you know, let's stay together, etc. One of them, Cliff Richard, already kind of like, you know, investigated and etc. etc. Yesterday, seriously, that was a frivolous comment. Yesterday we had Tom Devine, Scotland Post leading, inarguably leading a most respected historian and historical authority, coming out for yes, and that had been a kind of sort of long, slow journey. And I think that and other things coming out for yes or no, they won't be the fundamental game changers, but they could add to some way, you know, the way that the momentum is going. And I think it's very significant what Devine said, because he said, and this is just an observer, and some of you will see this, so he says about Scotland and about Britain, he says, it is the Scots who have succeeded most in preserving the British idea of fairness and compassion in terms of state support and intervention. Ironically, it is England since the 1980s which has embarked on a separate journey. Now, I want to pose this comment straight at the start because I think the British idea of fairness and compassion is a profoundly, mainstream, deeply historically embedded idea. It runs through the Quaker history of British progress. The empire was built as a civilising project to the empire builders, and we find that hard to believe now, but you know, lots of lefties believed in the empire, lots of Fabians believed in the empire. And I think this is problematic, not just at a British level, which we can get into at some point, but I think it's problematic at a Scottish level. Because is this what we aspire to preserve the British idea of fairness and compassion? And actually, are we even doing that now? You know, are we doing it, and do we want to do it? So I want to go into that and explore that on a couple of levels. Firstly, I want to say that there's I'm going to get into some of the kind of like things we don't want to get into in Scotland about kind of like our society and how central or not these are to the independence question and debate. But just let me pose this right at the start. There's many positives in modern Scotland. There's many wonderful things. The fact we've got Parliament after 20 years of debate. The fact that Parliament is uncontested. It's the main political institution of Scotland. You know, nobody except a few, you know, marginal voices want to abolish it. In fact, UKIP policy until last year was to abolish the Scottish Parliament. And I am sadly one of my few influential roles. Was that I wrote an article on this because they didn't talk about this policy, and it got to Nigel Farage, and in 1 week, because they were reviewing policies, that policy was binned and lost, which some people point out might have been helpful to the no side, because the policy of a tiny bit of the no side being for the abolition of Parliament could have been embarrassing. So nobody's really in favour of abolition of the Parliament. We have an independence debate. When part of Scotland said they wanted it, when the SNP won in 2011. That's different from other places in the world, obviously Catalonia being the main example. So those are significant advances. I think the increased cultural confidence of Scotland, the fact that in all my adult life, I don't remember 1979, but since then, we have lived in a time of enormous energy of cultural impulse, of writers, playwrights, art, wonderful novels being produced, and getting into some areas that's difficult about Scotland, sectarianism, sexuality, all sorts of things. So that's pretty significant and historically significant. That is like a cultural renaissance. It says something about who we are, who that we is, and how we present ourselves to the world and understand. Now, there's also more important things the way that may be, because jobs and the economy matter. Sometimes we don't think that in terms of the debate on independence, but Scotland is the fastest growing part of the United Kingdom, apart from London and the South East. Since 2010, the area with the highest growth in private sector jobs, after London, is Scotland. The area with the biggest foreign direct investment in the last 4 years in the UK, apart from London, is Scotland. Scotland is, with lots and lots of caveats about the poverty in the country and inequality, is an economic success story. I did a Chatham House event with people, I shouldn't say which newspaper it was, 4 weeks ago in London, and they didn't have much of an understanding of Scotland, but the economic correspondent said London and Scotland are the economic success stories of the United Kingdom. Take them out, leave the rest, and we've got a country that's middling and struggling, etc., etc. And I think there's where Scottish public opinion lies. There's the rejection of the marketisation of public services, which is absolutely fundamentally ingrained in the Scottish psyche. So, I don't think that what's happened to English NHS can be completely characterised as privatisation in the traditional sense, but it's outsourcing, corporatisation, fragmentation, and it's something that, if Labour don't win the next election at UK level, well, there will be a UK in 2015. That may well be unputbackable, and that is huge. Scots want, it's not just our professional elites or our politicians, Scottish public opinion. 57% yesterday said, when we took out the don't knows, what was happening to the NHS could be a significant influence on them being pro-independence. And we've got years of polls that show that Scots don't want private sector involvement in core public services like education and health. And then there's an increasing sense of autonomy. 64% of Scots want welfare policy decided in Scotland, 56% want tax policy. So people want Scotland, a made in Scotland state domestic policy. We're not maybe just sure about the rest, which is foreign policy and defence. So it's all these positives of a nation that is, we've got a parliament, politics have shifted, culturally we've moved, there are good things happening economically, and there's this growing sense of autonomy and possibility. Now from that, I want to say a few things that I think are a bit more challenging. There are some profound myths about modern Scotland. And this is what I identify in the book, certain myths that I think define modern Scotland. That we are egalitarian, that we are the land of educational opportunity, that we're a social democracy, and that we're a land that holds power collectively to account. Now if you think the egalitarian one, Scotland's actually basically as unequal as England, if you take London, they're basically the same. I've got graphs in my book on wealth inequality in Scotland, and between the top households and the bottom households, it's, you'll see there's two nice little houses, one a wee one, the poorest house is one a big one. And the gap between the two is 273 times. The top 100 families in Scotland own £21 billion, and in 1 year, last year, their wealth went up £3 billion, £3 billion in 1 year. That's because the asset bubbles going on in Britain and America. So we're not egalitarian, and we're not the land of educational opportunity. I mean, seven working class kids got to Glasgow School of Art last year. That's with an access programme. The figure for St Andrews was 19. And that's related to, well, particularly St Andrews in Edinburgh, of course, related to private education crowding out those institutions. And if you think about us being a place that holds power to account, I think you have to look at the longer story. Look at RBS, when RBS blew up. Now RBS blew up under British banking regulation, obviously. But when that happened, the whole British political class, Gordon Brown, David Cameron and Osborne, because they were in opposition, Alex Salmond and the SNP, they all were playing a game of how close you be to RBS and those kind of like masters of the universe. And now they fight the opposite battle of who was least close, who was most close that they could tap, which is kind of pathetic, a pathetic argument. They were all implicated, and clearly the British banking regulation is the responsibility of the British government, not the Scottish government, but there's an equal culpability of believing in a problem version of banking and the economy. So there was that, there was the implosion of Rangers Football Club, which, those of you that are Scottish will know that before the independence referendum was the big story in town. This was the biggest football club in Scotland. It blew up in a tale of mismanagement. A huge tax case that the HMRC took, actually then was found against HMRC, but one of the huge dimensions in that was the media, until the last stage when the whole thing blew up, the media and public life in Scotland did not ask questions of that institution, did not ask questions of power, because the people that ran Rangers were the same kind of people who were kind of like mini bankers. They were out with the Fred Goodwins and so on, they were getting loans and things like that. There was a whole sort of story there about how finance is done in the corporate world and how it's kind of not ethical, not sustainable. So from that, from those good stories and then those historic myths, I should say the idea of myths came to me from Fintan O'Toole. He wrote 2 books on Ireland after the crash, where he said Ireland basically, because Ireland was such a terrible economic crash, they had believed an idea of themselves as a republic, that they weren't like England, UK, and that they were somehow ethical. They bought into a whole set of a corrupt version of capitalism and sort of spirit of making money, and they needed to recognise that their myths prevented seeing who they really were. Now, our journey isn't as brutal as that, isn't as horrendous as that kind of crash, but in our soft myths, there's maybe something less of a chance to see them. So I just want to pose this to you as some questions that those myths are really, I think, in part of the independence day. I only want to emphasise part, actually being reinforced day in day and day by day. The idea that Scotland's more egalitarian, that we're inherently progressive or more progressive than England, even social democratic. No place, if you think of it, is actually inherently progressive. You make the values you live by and choose day by day in the choices you're making and the kind of the conversations that go on, the political decisions made. And there's an issue that middle class gains like tuition fees, free care for the elderly again, and both in inverted commas, that these are somehow progressive or define us. Now you think about those things, think about the council tax fees. These are all actually progressive. These all actually work in favour of middle class groups more. They don't target those in needs, but they're seen as totals of how progressive we are. And so a version of Scotland put forward by the SNP is, we are the land that don't have tuition fees, that has free care for the elderly, that has bus passes, etc., etc. Now these might be all noble and good things on their own, because citizenship and universal benefits are good things, but they're not necessarily progressive in terms of who they're targeting and sort of distributional consequences of that. And there's also the issue about our public services. Are our public services, are they stating and embodying the values we believe we are as a nation? As we're having this great democratic debate, our public services are changing by the day. 999 calls are being centralised. There are armed police walking up and down the streets of Scotland. Highland towns have armed police walking up and down in tiny Highland towns with no parliamentary vote, no parliamentary debate. So something's going on in our public services while we're having this great historic debate. And are we happy with that? And really, are all our enemies, our political enemies anyway, external? Are they all at the border? Are they all, you know, clearly marked Tories, wearing black hats rather than, you know, the nice white guys and gals on this side? Because I'm not sure they are. There's part of our debate is a little bit about, we're all right, we have virtue, the problems are all on the border, the threats are coming from Tories, Whitehall, you know, the privatisers there. So, just to kind of take us into a concluding part, what I think this tells us about the independence debate is that part of our independence debate is telling ourselves partially comforting stories about ourselves, that everything is all right, that everything's going to be all right. Can I trust our Scottish political class, trust the Parliament, you know, it's all going to be all right north of the border. Now, it's sometimes good to be told reassuring stories. This is a turbulent time in the world. Look at the Ukraine, look at Syria, look at Iraq. But is that really it? Because here's Tom Devine, and this is just before he talks about British fairness. He says, the Scottish people are wedded to a social democratic agenda and the kind of political values which were sustained and were embedded in the welfare state of the late 1940s and 50s. Now, that's a nostalgia. That is a back to the future kind of world. That is the world of, and I hear it from Tom, I hear it from Joyce McMillan, I hear it from others. It's a world of saying, I heard it last night in the book festival, can we, the Britain of 1945, the Britain of 1945 to 75, I know in many ways it was civilised, but we can't go back to it. Because it was based on a kind of version of society, international capitalism and hierarchy that isn't obtainable now. We're in more turbulent, difficult times. And that radical nostalgia, which I'm not quite sure the radicalism of it, is a sense of loss and losing one's compass in the modern world. And it's okay to feel a bit uncertain about the world, but we cannot build social change on going back to something. And I think that what we have to try and do is look at those myths and say, is that what we want to be? We have to engage in a bit of myth busting, to look at educational, what's happening in education, to look at the social apartheid and that, to look at how unegalitarian we are, and say, you know, if we want to define ourselves by being egalitarian, by educational opportunity, by words like popular sovereignty, which is another great myth, then let's look at ourselves and say, that's who we want to be, that's who the modern 21st century Scotland wants to be. And we take a hard look at it and we mobilise our resources and we do things on it. You know, we don't pretend that we actually do things that the working class kids are excluded, the bright kids are excluded from university now, the 130,000 college places lost because of the cuts. Those sorts of things, that we take tough choices and we're honest and can humble and bold at the same time. And I think, let me just conclude with this, because I think the debate is about much more than independence or statehood or even sovereignty. It's about social change, and it's about how we do social change. Is social change possible in a progressive sense in the United Kingdom, and obviously, and to extend the European Union as well? Or is it possible in a Scotland that has some element of power in the European Union? Now, I happen to think, pragmatically, that the British road is kind of buggered in the medium term anyway. So obviously I can't see beyond about 20, 30 years in that. And I'd be happy to be proven wrong on that. I'm happy if Ed Miliband's Labour Party woke up, you know, was popular and had a radical programme of what it was going to do about what's wrong with Britain, but I don't believe it. And so I think, hesitantly and not black and white, that our best road is to embrace some form of self-government, some form of independence, and see if we can build kind of a society that doesn't tell ourselves comforting stories all the time. Clearly we'll have to have some that actually looks at ourselves in the mirror and says what we want to do. Here's the quote I want to leave you with on this, which is from Danny Dorling. Now, some of you will know Danny Dorling, Professor of Political Geography at Oxford University. Now, Dorling is the UK's foremost expert on inequality, and he said in a recent lecture at Edinburgh, some of you would have been at, about, he said, what is the key question about this debate? And he said, as far as I'm concerned, for you, for us, for you to have a vote, It's, do we really believe we can trust each other? And I think that's what it's about. You know, it's a soft question and it's a penetrative question. This debate is about trust. Do we really believe we have it in us to bring about change, to kind of like, you know, to have change is about more than politicians in the Parliament, and to kind of grow a different culture, not just politically, but a wider culture of change that kind of confronts some of these things, is honest without being too hard on ourselves, but it's hard in a kind of soft way, if we can, you know, mix more meanings. I think we maybe can, but like anyone, because I'm honest, I have doubts. I have my hesitancies as well, and I think it's okay to be hesitant in this debate. So, you know, most of you said you know how you're going to vote. I guess many of you have had many different journeys to where you've got to. But a little bit of honesty and a little bit of not thinking, we can just do it by, you know, going back to the British idea of fairness, back to the future, 1945. One thing is sure, the future is going to be very, very different and a little bit more bumpy than that world of 1945 to 75. Thank you.